Welcome to another episode of Mastering Cybersecurity, developed by BareMetalCyber.com. Let's dive in.
Threat, vulnerability, and risk are often used as though they describe the same problem. A security alert may be called a risk, an unpatched system may be called a threat, and a possible attacker may be called a vulnerability. Those labels sound close enough in casual conversation, but they point to different parts of a security decision. If the label is wrong, the response can also be wrong. A team may buy monitoring when it needs remediation, repair a weakness that has little exposure, or report technical activity without explaining the potential business loss. In this episode, the practical question is simple. How do you tell these terms apart without separating them so completely that their relationship disappears? By the end, you should be able to identify what could cause harm, what weakness could make that harm possible, and what loss the organization may face when those conditions connect. A threat is a person, action, event, or condition capable of causing harm. A vulnerability is a weakness in technology, process, configuration, design, or human practice that could be exploited or triggered. Risk is the possibility of loss when a relevant threat can affect something the organization values through a vulnerability or other exposure. These terms are related because they describe connected parts of one security problem, but they are not interchangeable. Threat points to the potential source or cause of harm. Vulnerability points to the weakness that may allow harm to occur. Risk points to the uncertain outcome, including both the chance that harm will occur and the seriousness of the consequence. People confuse the terms because they often appear in the same sentence, the same incident report, or the same assessment. The fastest way to separate them is to ask which part of the problem the term is describing. Start with the threat. In cybersecurity, a threat may come from deliberate human activity, accidental action, a technical failure, a natural event, or another condition that can damage confidentiality, integrity, availability, safety, finances, operations, or trust. Malware is a threat because it can alter, destroy, expose, or disrupt information and systems. A flood can also be a threat when it can damage equipment or interrupt a facility, even though no attacker is involved. The word threat does not automatically mean an active attack, and it does not tell you how likely the harm is in a particular environment. It describes capability or potential, not the complete level of danger. A threat may exist broadly while presenting very different levels of concern to different organizations. The useful question is not only whether the threat exists, but whether it can reach and affect the specific asset, service, data, or process under consideration. A vulnerability is a weakness, not the person or event that might take advantage of it. The weakness may be technical, such as outdated software, an insecure default setting, or missing access control. It may also be procedural, such as an approval process that does not verify sensitive changes, or operational, such as backups that are not tested. Human practices can create vulnerabilities when they make harmful actions easier, but the person is not automatically the vulnerability. A reused password is a vulnerability because it weakens account protection. Repeated unauthorized login attempts are threat activity because they show an attempt to gain access. Keeping those labels separate helps identify the right response. Vulnerabilities can often be reduced through patching, stronger configuration, better authentication, improved process design, training, testing, or compensating controls. The word vulnerability tells you where weakness exists, but it still does not tell you the full consequence if that weakness is used.
Risk describes potential loss, so it requires more context than either threat or vulnerability alone. To discuss risk clearly, identify what the organization values and what could happen to it. The affected item may be data, a business service, a physical system, a legal obligation, a financial process, a person's safety, or the organization's reputation. The same vulnerability can create very different risk depending on where it exists and what depends on the affected system. An outdated component on an isolated test device does not automatically create the same risk as the same component supporting a critical public service. Risk also includes uncertainty. It is not a statement that harm will definitely occur. It is an evaluation of possible harm, usually informed by likelihood, exposure, existing controls, and consequence. Calling every weakness a high risk skips the analysis that explains why one issue deserves immediate action, while another can be monitored or scheduled.
The relationship among the terms becomes clearer when you connect them in the correct order. A threat has the capability to cause harm. A vulnerability creates an opportunity or pathway for that harm. An asset, service, or business process gives the potential consequence its meaning. Risk exists when those elements can combine in a way that produces loss. Remove or greatly reduce one element, and the risk may change. A serious threat with no practical path to the asset may create limited current risk. A severe vulnerability with no meaningful exposure may also create less immediate risk than its technical rating suggests. On the other hand, a common threat combined with an easily exploited weakness on a critical system can create substantial risk, even if the technology itself is not unusual. Security decisions improve when the organization evaluates the connection rather than ranking each term in isolation.
Different controls reduce different parts of that relationship. Patching, secure configuration, multi-factor authentication, and segmentation often reduce vulnerability or exposure. Monitoring, threat intelligence, filtering, and access restrictions may reduce the likelihood that threat activity succeeds or remains undetected. Backups, incident response, redundancy, insurance, and recovery planning may reduce the consequence after harmful activity occurs. No single control automatically addresses every part of the problem. A backup can reduce the operational impact of data loss, but it does not remove a weak password. Strong authentication can reduce unauthorized account access, but it does not eliminate the possibility of service failure. Precise language helps a team select controls for the condition it actually needs to change. It also prevents false confidence, because reducing one vulnerability does not mean every relevant threat has disappeared or that the remaining risk has reached zero.
Before we continue, a brief promotional note. This episode is brought to you by the Bare Metal Cyber Academy. The Academy provides a place for people who want to continue developing practical cybersecurity knowledge through clear, structured education. Topics such as threat, vulnerability, and risk become more useful when you can connect definitions to sound professional decisions, and that kind of applied understanding is central to continued growth in the field. Visit baremetalcyber.com to explore the Academy and see the learning opportunities currently available. Now, let's return to the distinction among these terms and examine the mistakes that can weaken security communication. One common mistake is to use risk as a general synonym for anything undesirable. A suspicious message may be called a risk, even though it is more accurately evidence of possible threat activity. A missing patch may be called a risk, even though the missing patch is a vulnerability, and the risk depends on exposure, exploitation potential, affected assets, and consequences. Another mistake is to call an attacker a vulnerability. The attacker is a threat source, while the weakness that enables access is the vulnerability. These errors are not merely grammatical. They can hide ownership and delay action. Threat activity may require investigation and containment. A vulnerability may require remediation or a compensating control. A risk may require an acceptance, transfer, avoidance, or reduction decision by someone with authority over the affected business outcome. Correct labels make it easier to assign the right work to the right people. Evidence also needs to be separated from the concept it may indicate. A log entry, alert, blocked connection, or unusual authentication pattern is not automatically the threat itself. It is evidence that may support a conclusion about threat activity, and it must be interpreted in context. In the same way, a scanner finding can identify a technical weakness, but the scanner output does not by itself establish the organization's complete risk. The finding may omit business criticality, network exposure, existing controls, exploitability, and operational consequences. Security teams often work with partial evidence, so their language should reflect what is known and what is still being evaluated. Saying that an alert indicates possible credential abuse is more precise than declaring that the organization faces a confirmed high risk. Precision protects credibility and helps decision-makers understand whether they are looking at an observation, a weakness, an active event, or a potential loss. Risk changes with context because both likelihood and consequence can change. Likelihood is influenced by exposure, threat capability, attacker interest, frequency of relevant events, control strength, and the effort required to cause harm. Consequence is influenced by the value of the affected asset, the duration of disruption, the sensitivity of data, legal duties, safety concerns, recovery capability, and dependence on the service. These factors do not always move together. A highly likely event may have a small effect, while a less likely event may have a severe effect. That is why risk should not be reduced to a single dramatic word, such as critical, without an explanation. A useful evaluation describes what could happen, how it could happen, what controls already exist, and why the remaining possibility deserves a particular priority. The result is a decision-oriented description, rather than a label detached from business reality. Clear risk statements connect the terms without collapsing them. A strong statement identifies the relevant threat, the vulnerability or exposure, the asset or process at stake, and the consequence that could follow. It should be specific enough to support action, but careful enough to avoid claiming certainty. For example, a statement may explain that credential theft could take advantage of weak authentication and lead to unauthorized access to sensitive records. That sentence distinguishes the threat activity, the weakness, and the possible loss while showing how they relate. It also opens practical questions about ownership. A technical team may strengthen authentication, a monitoring team may look for misuse, a data owner may assess consequence, and leadership may decide whether the remaining risk is acceptable. Good communication does not require complicated wording. It requires each term to perform its own job in the explanation. Prioritization becomes more defensible when threats, vulnerabilities, and risks are evaluated together. A long vulnerability list can create the impression that every item deserves equal urgency, but urgency depends on more than the existence of weakness. Exposure, active exploitation, business criticality, control coverage, and recovery capability can move one item ahead of another. Threat information can sharpen that decision when it shows that a relevant capability is being used, but threat activity alone still does not define the business consequence. Risk management brings the technical and business views together so limited time and resources can be directed toward the greatest expected harm. After controls are applied, some uncertainty usually remains. That remaining exposure is often called residual risk. The organization then decides whether to reduce it further, accept it, transfer part of it, avoid the activity, or continue monitoring as conditions change. A practical way to apply the distinction is to test any security statement with 3 questions. First, what could cause the harm? The answer should identify the threat source, action, event, or condition. Second, what weakness or exposure could allow the harm to reach the asset? The answer should identify the vulnerability, not merely repeat the threat. Third, what valued outcome could be lost, disrupted, altered, exposed, or damaged? That answer describes the consequence that gives the risk meaning. You can then refine the risk by considering likelihood, existing controls, and the seriousness of the impact. If a statement cannot answer these questions, it may be incomplete, mislabeled, or too vague to support a decision. This test works for assessment findings, incident reports, project reviews, control discussions, and conversations with leadership because it turns broad security language into a clear chain of cause, weakness, and potential loss. Threat, vulnerability, and risk describe different parts of the same security problem. A threat is what could cause harm. A vulnerability is the weakness or exposure that may allow the harm to occur. Risk is the possibility and consequence of loss when a relevant threat can affect something the organization values. The distinction changes what you do next. Threat activity may require detection, investigation, or disruption. A vulnerability may require repair, hardening, or another control. Risk requires a decision about priority, ownership, treatment, and acceptable remaining exposure. Using the terms correctly does more than improve vocabulary. It helps technical findings become useful business decisions without losing the details that security teams need. The most reliable practice is to name the cause, the weakness, and the possible consequence separately, then explain how they connect. That produces a clearer assessment and a response aimed at the actual problem.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.